Hey everyone, welcome to AnthroDish. Today is the first interview for AnthroDish, episode 1, and I am delighted to share that the guest today is a dear old friend of mine, Michael C. Duguay. We first met when he was a DJ in our hometown of Peterborough, Ontario, but through the years he's experienced so many different careers and cities and different lives almost. He's been a chef, a musician, an artist, a writer, and everything in between. He's truly a Renaissance dude and a fascinating person to sit down and talk about food with. On today's episode, we discuss what led him to making food and music in his life. We discuss the creative and spiritual similarities between food and music, how addiction and sobriety have respectively influenced them for him, and so much more. At the time that this interview was taped, we had just heard about the unfortunate passing of Anthony Bourdain that morning. So we speak to his legacy and the ways in which a meal can become a ritual or a sacrament, creating a context and a memory. At one point in the interview, Michael says that when he writes a song, it's the result of every song he's ever listened to. And I think after listening to this episode, you'll feel the same way that I do, in that the same could be said about his own life. He's a real rad dude, and I'm very excited to speak with him and share his story on AnthroDish today. All right, so today on AnthroDish, we're interviewing Michael C. Duguay. I asked him to provide me a bio, and all he wrote was failed artist, phony chef. So is there anything that you'd like to fill us in on apart from that bio?
No, I think that's essentially it for now, yeah.
Okay, sweet. So can you give us a little bit of background about where you've come from, where you grew up, some big influences that you had when you were growing up?
Yeah, certainly. So I grew up, I wasn't born in London, Ontario, but I grew up in Peterborough, Ontario, where I lived until I was 26. Peterborough itself was certainly, and the downtown community in Peterborough was certainly a huge influence on me and continues to be to this day. I grew up in or at least came of age in a really tight-knit sort of creative community where there's a lot of support, a lot of peer support, a lot of creative collaboration. Just a really tight-knit community, and it certainly has influenced my passion for and my support of, as well as my reliance on community and collaboration. In terms of more personal influence, and if we're talking here specifically about food and music, which is what we're here to talk about,
yeah.
I gave this some thought, and because we get asked about this sort of stuff all the time, but there's a number of things. I think certainly my parents divorced when I was when I was really young, and I don't remember my mom and dad being together at all. And they both remarried when I was quite young. So I sort of have the privilege and the advantage as an adult now that I was raised by not 2, but 4 really loving and generous and wonderful parents. And I received, I'm the product of the influence of those 4 people, as well as their extended families too, right? So I know when it comes to food, all of us are certainly influenced in one way or another, usually pretty directly by the food that we're served and consumed as children.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, coming from 2 different households, and they're pretty distinctly different households.
How so?
Well, I mean, truthfully, like I can't even wrap my mind around the fact that my mother and my father, who I know completely independent of one another, were ever married to one another. I don't get it. And yeah, they were just, they were, but as different as 2 households could be in many ways. My mother, we lived in the suburbs. They lived a pretty distinctly sort of suburban lifestyle, and I don't mean that in a pejorative or chastising way at all. They just very white bread, right?
Right.
Whereas my dad he lived sort of more centrally. So at a young age, I was kind of exposed very much to sort of the on a very small scale, sort of the difference that that these different sorts of communities that exist within cities or towns or whatever, the suburbs versus inner city, like just how that is, like the diets are different, right? They really are. And my stepmother, and in both my households, my mom and my stepmother respectively did most of the cooking. My stepdad he's a great cook. He comes from an Italian family, and he really nails Italian food. My dad is pretty good at barbecuing pork chops. Nice. That's about it. But my stepmom rather came from a large rural family. And looking back at that, I think there's something about cooking in a large rural family, and they were by no means wealthy when she was growing up, that you spread your ingredients pretty thin, and you make the most out of what you have. So at my mother's house growing up, I think given her and my stepdad's lifestyle, they were both, hardworking 9-to-5ers, and so were my mom and my dad and my stepmom certainly. But my mom's house, there was more sort of, I don't want to say junk food, but it was sort of junk food. I hope my mom doesn't listen to this. More like
less nutritionally dense food, perhaps.
Yeah, let's say sugar cereal for breakfast.
Yeah,
that sort of thing, right?
Yeah.
There was more chips available. There was more pop available, that sort of stuff. And whereas at my dad's house, it was, more fruits and veggies and trail mix and that sort of stuff. And I don't know if it was totally, at least I don't remember it being sort of articulated that it had to do with, nutritional intake so much as it had to do with like economy. And it's just two different ways of living, right? So I know, as a child, eating, all this sugar and sodium and preservatives and stuff. In one household where I did spend the majority of my time, my mom was our, had primary time with us, that, going from that to like less sort of, sugar fueled and salty food, I couldn't stand it. But interestingly now as an adult, like I really crave my stepmother's cooking all the time.
Nice.
The stuff that she made when we were growing up. So this is all just to say sort of like, there were from a very formative age, there was a lot of different influences coming all at once in terms of home cooking. By no means is anybody in my parents foodies. I wouldn't really call them foodies. But there were both households with multiple children where certainly dinner was something that happened every day, more or less. So, I was consuming homemade food daily, like, most people. But again, with this sort of variety of influence of 4 different people and their respective families. And interestingly, my twin sister she's a chef.
Oh yeah.
And she's an excellent chef. And she's quite successful as a chef now out in Halifax. And so I would certainly kind of thank her for introducing me to a different sort of take on food, a different sort of like celebration of cooking, as opposed to just the we need food on the table to feed our children sort of thing, like a real keen sort of passionate interest in it. And I was her taste tester from the day she got her first Easy Bake Oven and on. And so I was always sort of being given these little treats that my twin sister Danny was making around the house. But truthfully, my interest in cooking and preparing and even really consuming food intentionally didn't surface until much later in life. But
that was
certainly I would say, yeah, it was one of a few seeds. She was and continues to be a huge influence on how I cook and how I eat and all that. I do know as well, kind of going back to growing up in some blended families and with divorced parents, my dad, my mom having primary custody, my dad, there was a time where he was living kind of outside of Peterborough, and we wouldn't really go to his house so much as we'd see him once a week, Danny and I, he would take us out for dinner. And my dad had sort of more exploratory palate. And so we'd go out for, Indian food and Thai food and stuff that I might not otherwise have had the opportunity to sample at a young age. And always in this sort of like, it's like Thursday nights with my dad was sort of a sacrament, right? Like this, this special thing that I think, at least on a sort of a subliminal level, made me appreciate the meal as something that's shared and something that's special, and something that not necessarily reserved for like hugely special occasions, but that had some sort of import that I might not have experienced if it had been a less frequent thing or a more frequent thing. I don't know, but it was, Thursday nights with my dad were always a big deal when I was a kid. So,
well, it kind of creates like a sense of ritual too, right? Like, every Thursday you're going to kind of sit down, slow down, and spend time with your dad in a very unique way compared to like a normal meal at your house at that time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I mean, I always say, as much of I'm a lover of food, I'm a lover of restaurants. And I think perhaps that sort of stemmed from that. Cool. I think an interesting thing to mention too, and this is something I arrived at later in life as being as important as it is. And it's strange that I didn't really think about it before, but when I was 4, when I was in junior kindergarten, I was born cross-eyed. And I had to have reconstructive eye surgery when I was 4. And the sort of subsequent aftermath of that was that I had patches on both my eyes for quite a long time.
At the same time?
At the same time, okay. Yeah. Over half a year on both eyes, and then the remainder of about a year on one eye. So at this very formative age, I was blind.
Yeah.
And of course, because it was temporary, there was no point in teaching me Braille or how to walk with a cane or any of these things that folks who are permanently blind would have to learn to manage. Right. I just kind of got trucked around in a wheelchair, and didn't have to go to school. But coming from a family where there really, with the exception of my sister, there's no real foodies. There's no practicing artists really, no other musicians. It was sort of presented to me later in life from a therapist, in fact, who said, maybe you should sort of think about this a little bit more. Because in some ways it could be like small t traumatizing, right, at that formative age to lose that sense. But in another way, it sort of explains why I have these other, I'm really stimulated by things like taste and music.
Yeah.
Even scent, like I'm pretty obsessed with scent as well. I've got 4 candles burning around me right now.
At 10 in the morning, let's say.
At 10 in the morning, yeah. Yeah, if I walk into my apartment and there's like a lime going slightly bad in my fruit bowl on the other side of the loft, I can smell it right away. Wow. So yeah, I guess in a way I did have these other senses develop in a different way than they might have if I hadn't have been temporarily blind at that extremely formative age. So, and certainly my love for music, like I recall my grandparents, my mom's parents giving me a radio as sort of like a gift before I went through the surgery and the recovery from it. And of course, I don't really remember what it looks like, but I just remember the presence of that radio at all times. And just listening to music, and music very much being sort of a sense of comfort and a connection to the world, because I was kind of back, at that age, it's almost being back in this sort of like embryonic state, right? Yeah. Like totally isolated in many ways from the rest of the world. So I think there's certainly a lot there. And I don't feel the need to really explore it much further than I have, but in terms of my taste in food and my taste in music too, like I'm pretty open to anything, and that's not a conscious like forcing myself to be open-minded. It's that I genuinely do enjoy pretty much anything. There's really no food that I don't enjoy. I'm the least pickiest eater you'll ever meet, and I always say I'm opinionated, but I'm not picky. So.
That's important. I like that.
Yeah, and increasingly so as I grow older. So, so yeah, I think that in terms of influence, I think that has been a pretty strong one.
Certainly, that's really neat. So I want to go back to, you kind of started to talk about how growing up in Peterborough, there was a lot of like creative influence around you. Mm-hmm. So when did you start getting really into music in your life?
No, well, I mean, I always had that interest, and again, it stemmed from that, that radio my grandparents had given me. I think. Also, my dad is he's a huge music fan and music listener, and he listens with a very open mind as well. I was exposed to all varieties of music when I was a kid, and I'm really grateful for that. And my dad is a professional athlete. And my stepdad as well is not a professional athlete, but grew up playing sports, and I'm the only boy in the family, and I was certainly raised to to be an athlete and play sports. And I, I I never excelled really. I was competent, but I certainly never enjoyed it.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't from a very young age. I think I sort of like I sort of was like really resistant to that sort of like toxic masculinity, if I may use a really strong sort
Yeah.
of term. But like I felt really uncomfortable with like locker room mentality and like that sort of like gang, like, you know, boys will be boys sort of stuff. It always made me really uncomfortable, and I certainly never it was never congruent with how I felt. And I was definitely the teenager in the locker room with my Discman plugged into my ears while everybody else was doing their thing, right? And just sitting by myself until we hit the ice. So I guess I think around, you know, the end of elementary school, I started getting deeper into music as a listener. And it was in high school. So I went to St. Pete's. You were a student at St. Pete's as well. And it wasn't an arts and vocational school, but while I was there, it might as well have been. Like, it was, there's so much vibrancy in the student body in terms of creativity and even that sort of like collaborative stuff that I was talking to about Peterborough on a larger scale, but it was really present there as well. And I really thank the faculty, the teaching staff at that high school, some of our, you know, my creative writing teachers, my photography teachers, my music teachers, definitely my drama theater teachers, who really supported every whimsical and stupid little idea I had, and really encouraged me to go after that. And I'll never forget the conversation I had when I was in the car with my dad, and I told him, you know, and I was scared. I was really scared to bring this up, saying, like, you know, Dad, like, I don't want to play hockey anymore. I actually don't want to play sports at all anymore.
Which also, like, coming from Peterborough, which is a very hockey-centric town,
it is.
That's a bigger thing to say than, you know, if you're in Toronto saying that.
Yeah, certainly. And I don't think it had ever been. I mean, I don't want to speculate about how my dad had thought, but I don't think it had ever really been a question that I would stop playing sports. You know, and despite the fact that I went into this conversation pretty timid about it, you know, my dad's response was, and you know, it's a hockey town, but my dad is also, like, he's a hockey coach and a hockey player, and he ran a hockey school. Wow. He sat on national boards for the Canadian Water Polo Association. He had been a professional water polo player. You know, and his response was like, you know, that's fine. You just have to do something else, which in retrospect is the best thing a parent can do in that situation, right?
That's great advice.
And he said, what do you want to do? And I said, I want to play music. And you know, no word of a lie, there was an upright piano in the house a week later.
Nice. That's amazing. Good parenting.
And it is, yeah, it was, you know, looking back, like, that's very much a moment that defined my life, right? And I can't imagine which, you know, if my dad had said, no, you must continue to play sports. Like, I was at an age where I kind of probably couldn't have really said no, right? Like, I was 13, 14. Or at least I could have probably easily had my mind changed to try for a few more years, right? Yeah. So, but he really he understood that that's what I wanted to do. And certainly at my mother's household as well, so, you know, same thing with my mom and my stepdad. And so they really supported that. And I think that's also, like, guided my identity in many ways, is like, you know, I feel a lot of things in life, like, if you want to be something, if you want to do something, like, nothing's stopping you from just, like, giving yourself that title. I mean, credentials are certainly something, but, like, if you want to be a musician, you just call yourself a musician, and you're a musician, really, right? Like,
totally, yeah.
If you want to, you know, and of course you maybe have to purchase some equipment or whatever, but, like, realistically, if there's something in life you aspire to being, the first step is really just beginning to self-identify that way, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
I know there's been many times in my life where I've made somewhat reckless decisions, but it was sort of compelled by that sort of ethos that I think was kind of put into me in those moments as a kid, where my parents said, okay, you're a musician now. Great, let's do it, right? Let's get you a piano. So anyway, so I went to high school, and in elementary school, you know, I went to kind of a suburban Catholic elementary school, and I don't know that I was really bullied, but
in the sense that, like, any kid was, right?
Yeah, no, nothing gratuitous, but I certainly didn't feel like I fit in. And at a certain point, I think I became a little apathetic and just stopped even trying to fit in, which is which completely changed when I got to high school, where that apathy could remain, but I did fit in, right? Like it just like all of a sudden I was surrounded by like-minded people, and I met all these other students who wanted to, play music and make theater and write poetry and take photographs and do all this great stuff. And I really I kind of felt like I had arrived, right? And that in many ways that increases your self-respect and your self-understanding and your self-awareness, which really at that age is something that should be happening, ideally. And I also, I began to develop like really extremely close relationships with my friends, and sort of, was able to begin to navigate how to have like emotionally intimate relationships with other men, other people in general, but particularly like my bandmates who are they're all dudes at that time, and getting close on a much deeper level, and really learning how to support one another. And that was that's really colored my life ever since, attempting at least to develop relationships that are meaningful, and supportive. And through that, of course I was learning a ton about music, because I arrived at music as a teenager and not as a child, as many people do who have parents who maybe guide them into it. But so I was learning very rapidly about music and how to play music and about music history and about all these bands, and I was going to concerts, and we were putting on concerts, and learning about like not just about the music itself, but how a band operates and band dynamics and how to get along in a band unit, and all this really important stuff that I'm deeply, deeply grateful for. The guys that I was playing with back then, I'm still in touch with most of them, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, that's really special.
We, in fact, when I was in grade 11, I was playing in my first relatively serious band, and we had won a couple Battle of the Bands, so we had like a bit of a following. And so we decided to put on a show at the Gordon Best Theater in downtown Peterborough, which was a pretty large venue for us to be playing. Definitely. And we very tactfully, because we had played these Battle of the Bands, we had been exposed to bands from other high schools, and we very tactfully asked what we observed to be the most popular bands from every other high school in Peterborough to open for us. Nice. And so it was on November 1st, I guess that was 2002. And we there was a lineup around the street. People couldn't get in. It sold out. Wow. We played the show of our lives. We had an amazing after party afterwards, and got drunk and got to chat with cute girls, and it was this really formative moment. And yeah, it was this sort of introduction to this sort of rock star or whatever it may be, rock star culture, on a, for better or for worse, but certainly we definitely felt very, very cool. And that was in 2012, and still to this day, on November 1st of every year, I call every guy who was in that band. And for a while after, we would play shows on that year, or we would just get together and play music. And we still talk about, we've all moved on. We all live all over the country now and do different things. But we all do our best to kind of communicate with one another around that time, because it really was really, really important, right? To compare it to sports, it'd be like winning some sort of
OFSA championship.
Exactly. Yeah. So maybe you could relate to that in a sense, but, and then moving on, through graduating high school, I chose to stay in Peterborough. I didn't go away for university, and then sort of being, accepted by the larger arts community. And I was involved in theater and all that sort of stuff as well. I got more involved in arts administration stuff, sitting on boards, that sort of stuff. And again, just always had that sort of support from my community that I eventually sort of just took for granted, just because it was just all I knew, right? It was just all around me all the time. If I had an idea, a creative idea, I wanted to pursue it, I could. Nothing was really stopping me, because people are always supporting me, and that's a good place to come from, certainly.
Yeah. So when you're kind of entering the scene, you're starting to build up yourself as a musician and your community. Did you think much about food during that period of your life, or did it play a big role in touring or band meetings or anything, or not at all?
Well, I mean, it played a huge role in that, working as a dishwasher supported me through all of that. Like a lot of young artists and musicians, when I moved out of my parents' house, I had to get a job, and I wanted to play music. And the easiest way to do that was to get a job in a restaurant. So I got my first restaurant job was at 38 Degrees, which no longer exists. It was on Water Street in Peterborough. Yeah. And it was a great little restaurant with some really good cooks. Evan Pod, who now works out in Lakefield, had originally opened, and he was an incredible chef. And I still at home cook some of the meals I learned there for my guests. And it was one of those things where, I started it as a dishwasher, and then they had me doing prep, and then they got me on the line making salads and that sort of thing. And I just sort of discovered I had a knack for it. Admittedly, I didn't really take it too seriously, but I certainly realized that I had a skill for it. And truthfully, like, I had never really cooked a meal before for myself before in my life, really, until I moved out of my parents' house, right? Why would I have?
No, exactly.
And and even when I first moved out, it was nothing, it was just whatever, reheating stuff. But that was where I sort of discovered that I had a certain skill set. In terms of touring, touring, especially, like, there's different scales of touring, right? And I've been exposed to a few of them. And, I've done the, like, totally broke tour before. I remember the first tour I ever did, me and my friend Matthias Kalm had toured to the Maritimes together, just the two of us in a little hatchback. And we played a couple shows on Prince Edward Island, and we didn't know that you have to pay a tariff to take the Confederation Bridge back to the mainland. And so we spent like the literal last of our money on gas and went to take the bridge. And they're like, they weren't going to let us go, and we had to appeal to them, like, we have a show in Halifax tonight, we have to go. They did let us go. And we got to Halifax almost out of gas, no money whatsoever, and busked on the street long enough to share a hamburger at like a little, like, greasy spoon, right? But needless to say, that was a bonding moment, right? Definitely. And one that I'll never forget. Moving forward, like, when the tours got a little bit bigger, and, like, you got to eat, right? You're on the road, you got to eat.
Yeah.
Anywhere you got to eat. But there's part of touring is this really interesting sort of cultural experiment and cultural exploration where, like, you're going to all these places, but you're only seeing them in this very fleeting way. You're in and you're out. And a lot of the people you meet, like, there's a lot of conversation in the tour van at that stage in a career where it's like, okay, are they feeding us? Is there food tonight? Like, what are you gonna eat? Okay, what's their menu like? Like, you really want to eat some good food. And when I began to tour Europe, like, you can stop at a truck stop in Germany and get a sandwich that is better than a sandwich you paid $20 for in downtown Toronto a lot of the time. But then you're touring, alternatively, you're touring from Winnipeg to Vancouver, and there's only A&Ws. Like, and I remember waking up and us agreeing as a unit, like, in bands I was playing with, like, okay, we will not eat A&W today. We will find something up. And by the end of that day, we've ate A&W twice, right? Because it's the only thing available. So really, it's like, you're not eating we weren't eating for nutrition. We were really just eating, for pure sustenance. But a lot of things, like, memories I do have of being on the road are, like, these amazing hosts who are total strangers who would take us into their home and make us meals. In particular, my first few times in Europe and enjoying, like, European, like, continental breakfast for the first time, and eating, European street food. And there was certainly, we weren't eating at any Michelin restaurants, but getting a bit of a genuine sort of cultural introduction to the different
like the home cooked sort of culture.
Like home cooked food and street food, right, which are pretty authentic examples of food. But I guess in a way, like, it did teach me to, like, not really take anything for granted, right? Like, being fed by total strangers is pretty humbling.
Yeah, totally.
Even when it's coming, when they're really wanting to, when they're doing it very, like, enthusiastically, it's still incredibly humbling, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So food definitely, like, it began as a sort of, like, just to support my work as an artist. And then I was lucky enough to often have employers who were totally cool with me taking 2 months off to go on the road and come back and cook for a little bit and then head off again, that sort of thing. So it was a kind of it was an inconsistent theme, but it was a theme nonetheless.
Very cool. Well, it's also interesting. I mean, working in the hospitality industry, there's so many musicians and artists working in kitchens or sometimes front of house because of that flexibility, right?
Yeah.
So I kind of want to move into exploring that a little bit more, because you started at 38 Degrees, and since then you've worked at several restaurants over your lifetime.
Now by now I've worked at quite a few. Yeah.
So can you kind of talk about, I mean, particularly within kitchen culture, there's sometimes this vein of drinking and substance abuse issues that kind of arise through that. So can you kind of speak to your experiences witnessing that, or I guess living through that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I witnessed it so much as I just
didn't know how to delicately say that.
Engaged with it enthusiastically, right?
Yeah.
I think I was pretty blind to what other people were doing. I'll be candid. Like I spend a lot of time now in a 12-step community, and I spent a lot of time in addiction treatment centers over the past half a decade of my life. And the joke is, like, as a musician and let's say chef, for lack of a better word, I was sort of, I was destined to become a drug addict. I didn't really have a choice. I qualified from before I even picked anything up.
When you got that radio.
Exactly. Yeah. Thanks, Grandma. I mean, everybody, like, it's certainly, it's understood culturally. It's sort of fetishized, in fact, this idea that, kitchens and restaurant culture are drug fueled and alcohol fueled. And that understanding exists for a reason, because, in my experience, it's quite true. And, just those hours and the hard work. And I think these are things, it's become a bit of a cyclical thing where, like, it can become a bit of an excuse. Like, it's become a bit of a cliche, this sort of idiom, like, oh, well, we work these hard hours, it's so hot, we work so hard, that kind of thing, right? It's like,
the stress, the intensity.
Yeah. And like pretty much everybody I know has a stressful, intense job, right? in one way or another. But I mean, I guess it's really availability. And for me, when I think about that sort of like chicken and egg sort of thing, like, did I have this predisposition, and did I intentionally, like, I'm getting deep here, but did I intentionally sort of position myself in proximity to these things, to drugs and alcohol, by finishing high school and not going immediately to university, although I did later, but pursuing music and then getting into the restaurant world? Was it really because I knew that these things, because I had that sort of desire to basically obliterate myself all the time?
Right.
And I mean, again, I'm not being able to remember what I witnessed around me so much as how I engaged with it. But certainly from like a young age, there were restaurants where, when it was busy, the servers would come back with a tray of shots, or I'd come in the morning to find drugs on my cutting board that were mine for the taking, kind of thing. And certainly I was appreciative at that time. It was just, it was always around. You finish work, and instead of going home and setting aside the money you earned that day, you go spend it all immediately at the very restaurant that you're working at, right? And I mean, of course, in music too, like, I like to clarify, like, and this is through a while working past this stuff, that, like, all that stuff, all the, the addiction, the drugs, the alcohol, whatever is, I'm grateful for it, right? And I look back to, say, in high school, when me and my buddies were, like I was speaking to earlier, really bonding in a really intimate and meaningful way. Like, we were stoned out of our trees, right? and like, and it was great. It was really, really, really good. And it wasn't until later in life that it got, not so good, and then it got really bad. But, and I mean that, like, emotionally more than anything. But, I'm grateful for a lot of, I did a lot of things in my life, made a lot of decisions in my life that, for all intents and purposes, were very reckless, or at the very least sort of whimsical. And they were decisions I wouldn't have made if I had been in a sort of more stable state of mind. Like, I moved to British Columbia from New Brunswick, basically on a whim, about 5 years ago. And there's no way in hell I would have done that if I was sober. And then I had an amazing summer in British Columbia. I worked at an incredible restaurant that I never would have worked at otherwise. Learned so much about food, made some really, really good friends. And that never would have happened if I hadn't made, that kind of reckless decision, right?
Mm-hmm.
So going back to your question, yeah, it's true what they say. It doesn't have to be, but in my experience, it was.
But it's certainly there.
And
Like it's very present no matter where you work.
absolutely, yeah, absolutely. It's just, again, it's a proximity thing, right?
Yeah.
So, from, my earliest days of working in kitchens, that's something I associated with it. And of course, my earliest days as an artist and a musician, something I associated with it too, is very much part of my practice. Especially when I started working more independently, was to get a little messed up.
So I think let's move into kind of talking about the creative process, working in kitchens, creating dishes, creating music. They're so interconnected, particularly because there's so many artists working within the food industry. So when you're creating, do you tap into similar parts of your mind, creating a meal as you would creating music?
Absolutely. Yeah. Like 100%. I was thinking this morning, when I read the news of Anthony Bourdain having died, and there was one thing that he said, that I had arrived at independently, sort of this idea, but then when I read it, it sort of like galvanized my belief in this. And he had said something along the lines that like, context and memory are like the most important parts of the best meals we enjoy in life.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, and I believe that strongly, and I think it really applies to the food I make and the music I make. And I'm a big believer that every dish I prepare is the end result of every dish I've ever consumed. And every song I write is the result of every song I've ever listened to. And the ones I liked, the ones I didn't like, what I said earlier, I'm pretty open-minded and enjoy mostly everything. But in many ways, I think that, the memory I'm drawing on, like there was a time in my life where I was living in Thunder Bay in pretty much total poverty. And I was living off like literally one corn dog, like one pogo corn dog every 3 days. And that's what I subsisted off of. And like, that's influenced the way I cook, right? And I can't deny that. In the same way that when I've had the opportunity to eat at some of the best restaurants in Canada, that's at the same time and in the exact same way has influenced the food that I make. And I'm not suggesting that I make some sort of like mashup of those two necessarily, but what I'm getting at is that memory plays this incredibly important role in what we produce. And I think something I really love about cooking and playing music, and something I find similar about those two practices, is they, for me, really, really draw on, interpretation and imitation, and most importantly, sort of emulation. And something I really love, and I believe to be like an incredible privilege and a gift as a musician, is, if I hear a song on the radio and I like it, I can go home and play it on the piano or on the guitar and sing it. And in the same way, if I eat a dish at a restaurant, I can go home and do my best to emulate it, right? And that's a really cool thing. That's a real gift to, love something so much and to be able to go home and sort of enjoy it independently as well, and kind of changing those contexts, and then in turn being able to share it with other people. For me, both are, I'd say music as a practice, songwriting. Well, music as a practice is a little more collaborative for me than cooking. I don't have I don't work professionally in restaurants at the moment, and I don't really plan to for a while at least. But there's a lot of engagement with other artists or chefs or cooks who are producing. Something I've learned in the last few years of my life is like, if when I'm curious about something, I just find the source and ask them, right? And,
yeah.
If I go to a restaurant that I really, really love, and I know it's not, peak hours, I make a point of trying to chat with the chef if I can, or the owners, and talk about what they're doing and how they're doing it and why they're doing it. And it's the same with music, right? So in those ways, I think it really it taps into similar parts of my, I'd say the ethos are similar, and then parts of the creative brain are similar, for sure. And I think I draw inspiration constantly. I really, really do. And part of that is, I think it's pretty cool. We have access to like so much information now, with, social media and these different sort of sharing platforms, like half of the food I'm making at home is because I follow, of course, tons and tons of chefs and cooks in restaurants on Instagram, and I'll see this dish, and I don't necessarily emulate the whole dish, but there's one idea in that dish that I really, really love.
Yeah.
And I'll bring that home, and it's the same with, I'm listening to a random Spotify playlist at the gym, and a song I've never heard comes on. And I love this one part of it, and I don't go home and necessarily try to rip off that entire song, but there's a little idea that I could try to incorporate into something I'm working on. And I think that's like that kind of constant exposure certainly has its drawbacks, but I'm really appreciative of being able to, like, if I'm feeling a little dry creatively, if I feel like I'm hitting a bit of a block, like there's a lot of information available to me very, very, very quickly, which I think is super cool. And I think that in many ways, like, with music, there's the writing, and then there's the presentation, right? There's the performance side of it if it gets there, and cooking is similar too. There's the actual food itself and the working with different flavors and ingredients, but there's also the presentation, and then there's also the enjoying it with other people. And I am that nerdy guy who will, like, dedicate 15 minutes to perfectly plating a meal that I'm enjoying by myself at home on a Wednesday night.
I believe it.
But it's practice though too, right? It's practice for those times where I do have my friends over, right?
Sure.
And it's like, same way I practice, piano or guitar a few times a week or a few times a day, whatever, same sort of thing. So, in those senses, I think that those are some of the creative similarities for me. And I will say, on an emotional level and on a spiritual level, I gain the same sort of thing from both of them. I really do.
That's really beautiful. Sweet. So you mentioned, how these creative processes hit you on that emotional and that spiritual level. So I want to move a little bit more into your life now, I guess, and more so looking at nutrition and wellness. So has the role of food in your life shifted since you started recovering in terms of how you relate to it or how you create it?
Yeah, I mean, more than I can even really articulate in a number of ways. I mean, like, I spent, like I mentioned earlier, I spent quite a bit of time in treatment centers, and I went to 3 different ones, and they all had their unique properties and idiosyncrasies, and kind of got fed differently at all of them. But if there's one thing I learned that I could get from that in terms of my relationship towards food, was like just being grateful to have food on my plate, right? Like, whatever it may be. I was living in a halfway house in Thunder Bay where they fed us, Rice Krispies for breakfast every day, and bologna sandwiches and Campbell's soup every day for lunch. And, God, I don't know if I've ever enjoyed meals more before in my life, because I'd been starved. I'd been starving before I went there. I was living a life prior to that where if I was budgeting $25 for a day, that was a Mickey of vodka and a pack of smokes, and food wouldn't be drawn into that equation. And these places that I was living in were, of course, subsidized by the government and OHIP, and there was food available to us. So that's certainly that completely changed the way I thought about food in terms of, like, the extreme privilege we have in terms of our food accessibility.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't take that for granted now, and I don't know I will. How I wound up in Kingston was I went to a treatment center here, and a lot of these places, right, they're trying to put some weight back on their clients, right? So I think I put on about 35 pounds when I was there, and I didn't even really realize until I got out, and it was like French fries at every meal, and like a lot of really, really heavy food. But again, like, just very, very grateful to have food on my plate. So that's something that has really changed. Whereas I think prior to, when you're working in restaurants, there's always this kind of food around, and you're just kind of always eating nice food, and
you take it for granted.
You do, yeah. And I think in life, it's something that we often take for granted, particularly in the Western world or in the class that we live in. And so that's certainly completely changed. But in terms of my health and nutrition, I mean, like, it's the core of my well-being now. It really, really is. I very much believe in a sort of a holistic and balanced living now. And I've noticed that like when I'm not mentally or emotionally or, you know, spiritually doing well, food's kind of the first thing to go.
Yes.
Food and exercise, I say, with like, you know, I'll skip a day at the gym.
Yeah.
And not a rest day, like a day that I was planning on going. And then I'll go home and it's like, well, maybe I'll just order some pizza tonight, which is fine. Nothing wrong with that every once in a while, right? But it becomes,
no, for sure.
It sort of becomes this new cycle. And then it's like, oh, maybe I'm not going to go to that 12-step meeting tonight. And, you know, that sort of thing. Like it all sorts of, then the next thing you know, 7 days later, and this is what I'm talking to when I'm talking about these sort of like relapses as well, that there's like, it's not necessarily engaging with substances, but not living the holistic and balanced life that I want to live. And that often results in me just spending like a weekend alone in my apartment, not eating well and not getting exercise and not going outside and being social, all those sorts of things.
Right.
And again, yeah, food is 100% at the core of that. And, you know, it certainly lends stability and structure to my life. I've gone through phases where, like, you know, I'll start eating out a lot as well, which I think is equally unhealthy for me.
Yeah.
And I don't even necessarily mean in terms of nutrition, but it's just sort of like it's not the sort of structure I want in my life.
The balance.
Yeah, like, you know, I should be coming home and cooking myself dinner and then going back out. And I often don't really have the excuse that, oh, I need to, you know, eat at a restaurant right now. And going back to what we were talking about earlier, as a sort of like ritual or sacrament or whatever, like that to me is kind of what eating in a restaurant represents now. It's a sort of, and I often do it alone, but it's something I do as sort of a gift to myself, occasionally, instead of doing it all the time or getting takeout or whatever. And to that end though, I mean, like having, like in terms of my social life,
yeah,
you know, that it certainly has an influence on that because I have a very different lifestyle, I'm not hanging out in bars, despite the fact that I manage one, but I'm not,
how it goes.
I'm not, you know, I'm not like spending my night, like I'm at home in bed by 10 o'clock every night. I'm not going out and meeting people. That when I do meet people, what I really have to offer is like, hey, like it's, you know, I'm not going to buy you a shot of Jägermeister like I would have back in the day. It's, hey, come over to my house this Sunday. I'm going to make some dinner. Right. And that's really, really been a meaningful and vital part of my life. And I really like on the social, do you know that T.S. Eliot poem, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock? Are you familiar with that?
Oh, I think I read it in high school, but I don't remember it.
Yeah, I know we're not here to discuss century poetry, but there's that line in it that's pretty well known as the idea. He says like, I measure my life in coffee spoons or something like that.
Oh yes, yes.
You know, you remember that? Yeah, and
yeah.
like that's sort of like, I think when I look back at my life, like you know, I can certainly sort of like measure out my life, at least on a social level, with like meals I've enjoyed with other people. And that's really kind of the benchmark in my life of like, I spend a lot of time alone, not necessarily in isolation, but I live alone. I work pretty independently. It's a social enough job, but the work I do is independent. But those, you know, the real like, good moments that I have is having people over for a meal now. And socially as well, like I've become involved with a local farmers market, and I have this sort of project where I'll go there on a Sunday morning and I'll source 100% of my ingredients for a meal that night from the market itself, and I've got to know the vendors, and they kind of know I'm coming and show me what they've got, and then I try to make a meal that's 100% sourced from that market.
Yeah.
And so that's really cool too, is being able to engage with those people and learning more about their practices and their where they, you know, how they cultivate their food and why they do it and all that sort of great stuff too. So that certainly helped a lot. But in terms of like, yeah, nutrition, like getting sober and changing my lifestyle, like not surprisingly, I'm very in tune with my body now.
I bet.
At least as it compares to when I was using really heavily. And also like my primary substance when I was heavily addicted was one that totally suppressed my appetite. So I really didn't eat very often. But now like, like if I eat food with, say like with preservatives in it, I really, really notice it. I really, really notice it. And I also notice, going back to this sort of holistic balanced living, I notice that my response to it is, hey, I don't really want to go to the gym right now.
Interesting. Yeah. So it's like the lethargy maybe from eating.
Yeah.
Do you find
yeah,
that?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, there's nothing wrong with eating processed food if that's your thing. I think processed food is freaking delicious. And like I said, I grew up on sugar cereal, and if I could, I would eat it all day.
Cocoa Puffs forever.
I really, really would, but I just can't, right?
Yeah.
And and again, I acknowledge privilege and all this as well, but
Yes.
um, I, I've developed a certain sort of sensitivity to a lot of things that I didn't really realize I had before. And now I eat because I love food and I love flavor and I love cooking, but I also eat a lot of the time. I eat just to sort of, for fuel, and I'm aware of what I need. So very much I eat, like, I have the same thing for breakfast every single day. And it's just like super nutritionally dense. And it's delicious and it gets me going. And now if I don't eat it every morning, like, my day is, if I take a day off, my day is screwed.
Really?
Well, it's a big sugar spike in the morning with a lot of fruit and that sort of stuff, and
Right.
a lot of protein, all that, and it kind of really, I've just really come to rely on it. But yeah, in general, I'm considerably more in tune with my body and my needs, and so I can sense, or I can feel very strongly, in fact, when I'm missing out on something that I need. Mm-hmm.
So I want to talk a little bit about during your recovery. I know I've talked to a few people in my life who are recovering, and I've heard that sobriety can sometimes increase your desire for sugary foods. Did you find that at all, or did your palate change?
Yeah, my palate changed for sure. But it's, again, like I said, I've become more kind of aware of my needs, so that's influenced my palate, and my brain is way more open than it was. Like, I think more critically and more open-mindedly and more creatively than I used to. So I'm just eating and thinking about food very differently in that sense. In terms of sugar, I've discovered that I have a real sensitivity to sugar. Like a pretty painful one. And this is kind of a funny anecdote, but when I was living in a halfway house just outside of Thunder Bay, again, we were eating Rice Krispies and bologna sandwiches all the time. And I didn't have very much money, but one little treat I got for myself, and this is something I've always loved, is Reese peanut butter cups.
Ah, yes, so good.
Oh, I've always loved them. They were kind of my treat for myself. And so every Friday I'd go into Thunder Bay and run some errands or whatever. We were there pretty liberal with this place I was living. We get a bit of free time for ourselves every once in a while. And I would get, I don't know if you've seen them, but the 1 pound Reese peanut butter cups.
Oh, the giant ones. Do they have the candies inside? Or is that a different one?
No, I've seen the ones that do, but these were just straight, and it was it was literally a pound. This was a pound of chocolate and like heavily processed peanut butter. But I would go back and I would stay in my room that I shared with a couple other guys, and I would read a book and I would eat my 1 pound Reese's peanut butter cup. And then I was beginning to wonder why, and I was getting frustrated. Every Saturday I was in bed with a terrible migraine. And I was really kind of PO'd, because I was like, this is my one day that I'm allowed to I have some freedom and liberty from this halfway house, which isn't, the greatest place to be. It was nice, but, and I'm stuck in bed with this migraine. And it wasn't until after I put it together, it's because I ate a pound of sugar.
That'll do it.
Yeah, absolutely. But, and still to this day, not too long ago, I went through a breakup a couple months ago, and I treated myself to a tub of ice cream before I went to bed. And I woke up the next morning, I almost had to call in sick to work. I had a full blown hangover. It felt like a hangover.
Yeah.
And it was from consuming sugar. But yeah, I mean, in terms of I guess I was laughing the other morning when I was very enthusiastically putting 100% natural unprocessed almond butter on a puffed rice square, and thinking this is sort of a mark of adulthood, where I'm eating 100% natural almond butter and not even thinking about craft peanut butter.
Yeah.
I'm not desiring it at all, and I'm actually loving this and really desiring it and enjoying it,
and not just pretending that you like it because you're an adult.
Exactly. Yeah. And a lot of these things, that historically I would have not wanted to eat, or I would have only eaten because they were the only things available, are things that I really, really like. So certainly, yeah, there's been a change in my palate going back to that. But the sugar thing, I've seen it and I understand it, but also I think it might apply a little more to maybe, I don't want to generalize, but maybe alcoholics who drank a lot of beer, that kind of stuff, sugar heavy stuff. I was, by the end of my addiction, I was more, it was pills, right? So and they weren't sugar pills. So I wasn't really like, I think my diet was essentially nil at that point when I kind of finally came into recovery, that the desire for sugar really wasn't there. But I do love the taste of those one pounders peanut butter cups. But that was more just a treat, right? Like, I don't know that I needed
Certainly.
sugar so much. One thing that has changed, interestingly, is I drink so much water.
Oh, really?
I drink like, I probably, like, I have a 1 liter Swell bottle, and I probably refill it 10 times a day.
Oh, wow.
And the downside to that is if I don't drink water, I get dehydrated so quickly. But that's, and I'm no scientist, but I know that water is very good for me and for everyone. And it really, that's kind of been an interesting change. I certainly feel healthier as a result of that as well.
That's really neat. That's a cool side product.
Yeah, it is.
All right. So last question that I have for you. You've lived in so many different places in your life, particularly within Ontario. So in terms of when you think about like the characteristics in a city that make it really ideal for you as a creative, and in terms of food culture, are there any that like really stick out to you?
Yeah, I mean, there's places I've lived that I think certainly possessed all the qualities and characteristics of a community that I feel I could really thrive in. But that being said, while I lived there, I was so unwell that I was doing the opposite of thriving. But I certainly know the qualities that I admire in places. And, I was thinking about this again, to go back to learning of Anthony Bourdain's death this morning. And I was thinking about why I've admired him so much. And I put him in this league of people who are, I describe as like elegant punks.
Yes, that's a great term.
These really poetic and deeply thoughtful, at least they appear to be, I've never met them, but people like, say, Nick Cave or Patti Smith, and certainly Anthony Bourdain, like these really sort of graceful and generous sort of people. And what I think the theme in all of them is they live so unapologetically.
Yes.
And in a very authentic way. And for me, like, living unapologetically doesn't mean not apologizing for wrongdoings. It means living in a way that you don't really have to apologize, right? Being kind, being gracious, being generous, being compassionate, but being authentic while you're at it, right? He was certainly always appeared to me to be this really honest guy. So anyways, I really, that's like a quality that I like in a city too, is like authenticity, and a sort of like, I identify very strongly as a punk myself. And like, I think part of my punk ethos is a certain sort of like scrappy resourcefulness.
Yes, that's very punk.
Like it's DIY, right? It's a DIY ethic, and it's
but not Pinterest DIY.
No, I mean like building the life you want out of the hands that you're dealt, right? I mean on a much larger scale. And sure, if that includes making macrame wall hangings, absolutely. But I think that like the cities that I really admire, like Thunder Bay, although I was extremely unwell while I was there. And I did work in the restaurant industry there for a little while, and I don't totally know if I'm welcome back, but I observed exactly that. Like, I observed people building something very vibrant out of what very easily could have been nothing, right? Thunder Bay is so remote. You've lived in the next closest city in Winnipeg, and like,
and the next closest is a bit of a stretch, but.
Yes. Well, it is. The closest city to Thunder Bay is Winnipeg, right? And, And that's saying something, because it's very far away.
8 hours.
And there's just this incredibly vibrant restaurant community there, and chef community. And when I say community, I mean like capital C community, because these restaurants all really support each other. They're all friends. What I observed was staff moving around from restaurant to restaurant, but not in this sort of like turnover way. In this sort of like chefs being like, hey, I think I've taught you everything I can teach you. Why don't you go work for him over there? Because he's got a lot more that he could teach you right now, so that you can become a better chef, and then one day open your own restaurant.
That's very cool.
And they would do these some of the restaurants would like, they would flip their entire staff for an evening. Like, they would trade staff. So all the chefs and cooks from one restaurant would go to another. And sometimes they would do it without even telling the public.
Neat.
They would just do it because they enjoyed it, and they were confident in their skills. They knew they could pull it off, but they were so familiar with one another's work, again, because it's such a small, remote community, that they could pull it off because they were familiar with it. And I admired that endlessly. And I try not to live with regrets, but I do wish I had been a little more aware while I was there, and had been able to sort of be involved a little bit more. but those are the qualities I really, I look for. And again, Peterborough is not remote.
No.
But in a sense it is, it's not accessed by any major highways. It's certainly its own little,
until the 407 comes in.
Yeah.
Different story.
But it has its own little cultural ecosystem, right?
Very much so.
I grew up in that a little bit as well. So, but I live in Kingston. Kingston's very conservative. In many ways, it's very progressive in others, but I find the palates here are very conservative, like a lot of smaller communities that are catering to tourists.
Yeah.
You have to be careful. You have to be tactful. And the fact of the matter is that in these smaller cities, a lot of chefs move to bigger cities because there's kind of better, more exciting work. And I find there's a bit of a nasty cycle here of, conservative palates require that cooks and chefs cater to those palates, which is just reinforcing those sort of dull palates, right?
Yes.
And it goes around and around and around. And I think I look at Thunder Bay or Halifax, another place I've lived, where there's this extremely exciting culinary community. And again, I'm not talking like Michelin star stuff, but I'm talking about people cooking, doing their thing unapologetically and authentically. And I imagine at some point there was some sort of circuit breaker, like in I don't know that Thunder Bay was always this sort of exciting gastronomical place. At some point, somebody, and I don't know if this has been acknowledged publicly, but somebody did something that sort of guided people towards being a little more progressive and being a little more exciting. And I'm sure it was embedded in the comfort that comes along with being part of a supportive community.
Definitely.
But
some elegant punk in that community.
Yeah. Like there was, somebody did something reckless. Maybe a little drunk, and things change, right? And in terms of Kingston, like I'm not here, like, and don't get me wrong, I'm not being critical of. I think there's some very good cooks here making very fine food. I think their hands are somewhat tied, and that's acceptable. And the way I feel about Kingston is like I wound up here, it was just serendipity, I suppose, if you want to call it that. It was really just like I came here to go to rehab because my parents told me I had to come here for rehab at the age of 29, right? Where I was at the end of my rope. And I decided while I was in treatment here to stay here. And I made that decision in part because I had moved around so much. I had lived in, I think it was 7 cities in 2 years prior to coming here, essentially running from my problems. That when I got here and I started sorting my life out and things started getting more balanced. And I realized, the only way I'm going to have stability is if I try to cultivate it. And the first step is just making the decision that, okay, this is my home now. And there's been a lot of interesting things that have happened as a result of like sort of nesting in a community in my early 30s. I've been able to be very intentional about who I sort of like bring into my life, as opposed to like where I'm living in my hometown where you kind of just know everybody. And there's danger in it, and that I can very easily isolate here if I want. But there's also a certain sort of freedom in having a lot of agency in terms of living the life that I sort of want to live, and being very intentional about those decisions that I make. And I say about Kingston a lot, like it has everything I need. It doesn't have everything I want, but the things that I want that it doesn't have are things I probably shouldn't have anyways. So in a sense, where I'm at in my life right now is these are the qualities that I desire in a community. And certainly I have a lot of support, and I've met a lot of people here, particularly through the 12-step community, but a lot of people in general who have really made me feel at home here. And it is my home, and I plan to stay here. Nice. And in terms of like, talking about that idea of a circuit breaker changing things culturally, like I have no ambition whatsoever to be that person.
I was wondering.
No, not at all. Not at all. And I think it's easy for me to get excited and egoistic and cocky and think, okay, I'm going to be this force that changes this thing that I see as, I guess kind of somewhat problematic, which is just that cycle of like conservative taste making. But, that's not my job. I have a job. I like my job. and now that I'm playing music again and I'm making art again, and I'm beginning to self-identify as an artist and a musician again, like it really just isn't for me. That being said, I have some cool opportunities coming my way. I'm working on a couple pop-up kitchens.
Oh, cool.
Where I'm going to be doing like one night sort of restaurant style pop-ups, 5-course sort of stuff. I've been really exploring vegan food a lot recently. I was vegan for a spell back in the day.
Yeah.
But now I'm not, but I'm making a lot of vegan food and really enjoying playing with that. And there's certainly a demand in this community for more of that. So those sort of things, right? Just more like casual and fun. I really don't have a ton of interest in going back and working full time in a commercial kitchen. That being said, the dream is to open my own place one day, and ideally that'd be a place I could incorporate food and music and community and all those things that I love.
Nice.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, you've given us so much of your time. So before we go, I just wanted to offer you the floor. If you have any upcoming projects, you kind of mentioned the pop-up kitchen, but anything else that's kind of coming up for you that you want to share with the listeners, or any cool resources that you might want to share with us?
Personally, there's those pop-up kitchens, nothing set in stone. It's been an ongoing conversation for quite a while now. And truthfully, this conversation is reminding me that I should probably send some emails and get the ball rolling. But I mean, everyone's patient. We all just want to, do it when it happens. Performing music again. I'm recording at least the beginning of a new record in about a month up in Perth at my friend Jonas Panetta's place.
Nice. That's Evening Hymns, right?
Evening Hymns, yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, he's an old friend and roommate and bandmate of mine. So we're going up there just to kind of start. I've got a new band. I guess our kind of big gig this summer is at the Wolf Island Music Festival just outside of Kingston, which I think you would love, Sarah.
Yes.
It's that's kind of like, our big gig. And then it's, taking music seriously while still working hard at my full-time job, which again, I really love, and doing that sort of stuff. I was talking to you a little bit yesterday about how I've been inspired to start a podcast myself, by observing you getting this one going. And my good friend Chantal Lemieux has a pretty successful and really interesting podcast that I encourage you to check out. It's called Muses and Stuff. Are you familiar with that?
No, I'm not, but I'll check her out.
Yeah, I'll send you a link to it. It's really, really cool. As we were discussing, I know when I was first getting sober, I struggled very much with my artistic practice. And I was kind of reaching out to other artists who had entered recovery and had become sober, and how they sort of came back to producing and being creative. And there's a whole spectrum of answers that I received, and responses and encouragement and guidance that I received from all these people. And I thought it would be pretty cool to try to bring it into sort of one dialogue, which would be in the form of a podcast. And I had been thinking for a while, what's the best way to do this? And I think that a podcast would be good. Because I know at that time, if I could have just sort of dialed into a podcast on the internet, I probably would have found it really helpful. And again, going back to our earlier conversation, as a musician, as working in kitchens, as an artist, whatever, we live in this culture that encourages us to get really, really messed up all the time. But then once we cross this sort of invisible line, we become pretty ostracized, or at least we feel very ostracized. And I know having some sort of connection to people who have gone through similar things, this is exactly why 12-step programs are so successful. Is really meaningful. And I think particularly for artists who it's so ubiquitous, right? This sort of stuff. So that's something that I'm tinkering with. And I've got a few other. I'm going to
push you on that one.
Yeah, no, I think, the CFRC, the local campus radio station here, just this week started their podcast lab.
Nice.
So I have that available to me now, obviously for free. So
perfect. Yeah, use it.
It's definitely something to do. Yeah.
Yeah.
But other than that, just I'm collaborating with some pretty cool visual artists on a few projects. I've been practicing photography again. I'm working with a local poet on a performance. So all sorts of a lot of irons in the fire right now.
Jack of all trades.
Yeah, I guess so.
All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story and your life and everything with us. We really appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you, Sarah.
That was Michael C. Duguay, an elegant punk in his own right. Thank you for tuning in to AnthroDish today. We will see you next time.